there, Rule the Galaxy fans. This is Jessica, and we have a wonderful episode tonight for episode 219. I'm flying solo, and we've got Jason Fry here joining me. If you don't know Jason, well, I think it's time to get out of TV and films. It's time to get your hands on some Star Wars books because we have someone here who is such a prolific author, and he has you know contributed so much to so many different types of Star Wars literature over the years. And I'm just so excited to be able to talk with him today about his career and just kind of geek out about Star Wars in general. So, Jason, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me. And geeking out about Star Wars is what I do. So let's do it.
Wonderful. Well, I think that the best place to start with something like this is, just tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me about, your um career and, have you always wanted to be a writer? How did you get involved in Star Wars? And are you surprised by where you ended up and what you do every day?
Yeah, no, I'm surprised all the time. And one thing I, always tell myself is to being a Star Wars author is full of these pinch me moments, whether you're suddenly in the middle of like an insane email thread with really, really amazing creative people about like how stun blasters work, just something that actually happened for Essential Guide to Warfare, or just getting to work with other writers, or just kind of looking in the mirror and being like, wow, I'm writing Star Wars. Like, how did that possibly happen? So I think about that all the time, and never get jaded about it. I'm incredibly lucky to be able to do this. There are many, many people more talented than me who love Star Wars just as much, if not more. Well, maybe not more, but just as much, who don't get to do this. And I think about that all the time. And, one of the amazing things I'll add about being a Star Wars author too is that I have never met a single other writer or creative person who doesn't feel the same way, who doesn't feel like, this is an amazing chance and a huge responsibility, and doesn't come at any project. Everyone I've ever known comes at a project from the standpoint of loving Star Wars and wanting to do right by it, which is really kind of amazing to see. Yes, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. Even before there was a Star Wars. I mean, I was born in 1969, so I was writing little stories and things like that before I ever got to see Star Wars. And so I was 8 years old when the movie came out, and it just immediately had a huge impact on me. I mean, I love stories, but I never imagined there'd be stories like that. I mean, that were, full of cool stuff, but also had these kind of, hidden depths to them, which I couldn't really articulate at 8, but I knew they were there, that they were about family and values and good and evil and making your way, through the world and through destiny and other things like that, which is really essentially what stories are fundamentally. And so, I like to say, and it's true, that, by the, Darth Vader's ship is coming across the screen and it keeps coming and coming and coming forever. And by the time I saw the engines of that ship, my life was different. And, everything since then has been just, good luck and writing everything I can. And some of it got to be Star Wars.
Yeah, it strikes me that, you know, I don't think that I've talked to a single Star Wars author. I don't think I've listened to any interview with a single Star Wars author who doesn't have that exact same feeling of, I'm writing for Star Wars. I mean, that's such a cool thing to be able to, just be able to contribute to and never really have it become a common thing. But yeah, I don't know. It strikes me that there are so many people who are still contributing today who, have been around and saw the originals as they were coming out. And it just really strikes me like the staying power of this franchise and the fact that like when it latches onto you, it just really doesn't let go. And not only that, but it has such staying power among the generations. And I don't know, what do you think gives it that staying power?
Oh, it's a mix of things. I mean, part of it is that it's really fun. I mean, it's got, laser swords and pew pew and, cool special effects and all this, stuff that's really fun to look at. And that's great. But also I think it's deep themes. Lucas loved to talk about Joseph Campbell and Hero with a Thousand Faces, et cetera. And frankly, I think some of that came a little later after George got a little self-conscious about it. I think in the beginning, I think he just couldn't get the rights to Flash Gordon, but that's fine. But all those things are definitely in there, and it's every Star Wars story has surprising depths to it, and it makes you those depths and those characters and the world building and everything else. I mean, when a Star Wars story works, you want to stay with it. You want to kind of see around corners and know more about these characters, and know about the history of the ships and all this stuff. And that's I mean, one thing I'm careful about is that's not a substitute for the storytelling. The story has to work. But if the story works, then the way to stay with it longer is through things like that, which is really great. The other thing I love about it is it's kind of endlessly renewing. I mean, I was an original trilogy kid. I mean, like pretty much every dude in his mid 50s, like The Empire Strikes Back is my favorite movie. But there's a whole generation of prequel kids who are not kids anymore, and then there are sequel trilogy kids. When my own kids started watching Star Wars, it was right early in the Clone Wars, and that was their Star Wars, and something where they could start off on an equal footing, and you didn't feel like you were kind of left behind by not having 20 years of experience in it. Same thing, with the High Republic books now, etc. So the fact that it's endlessly renewing, but those stories kind of all draw from the same well and have the same values, I think is a great kind of secret weapon for the franchise.
Yeah, I think so. And hopefully that won't ever change. I think that it's so fun to be able to have a franchise that exists in so many different mediums, and it's great to be able to have the films, have these TV shows, have the novels, have the books. But I mean, for you, like it goes beyond that. I am such a huge fan of the reference books. I have 2 history degrees, and so I have joked many times that my history degrees have served me far better in analyzing a galaxy far, far away than it ever has in terms of, anything that's resulted in making me money in the real world. But, I guess
Yeah,
that's
you,
just
you can
my
see that we're faking it. Oh, a little Punic Wars there, and the popes and anti-popes or whatever it is. Yeah, definitely.
well, that's what's so fun is to be able to see the places where George and other storytellers were drawing such inspiration not only from the world that they knew and
Yeah,
the politics and culture and fears of their day, but then
yeah.
seeing when y- 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 you just see it in little ways other places. I mean, I've already told you, and everybody's very well aware that I'm a Mando person, and I love Duchess Satine. I
Yeah,
love the fact that Satine was based on Queen Elizabeth. She's my degree is in Reformation history. My
yeah.
my specialty is in the English Reformation and Elizabeth the First. And so when I got into Star Wars, and I was a casual fan forever, and then I consider myself a pandemic baby
Hmm,
because
hmm.
I found the Clone Wars during the pandemic,
Oh
and
God, what a perfect time for it.
so perfect, and for whatever reason, that was really what made it all come alive, and it's been, what, 3 years now, and, this is 3 years worth of Star Wars,
Oh
so,
wow.
yeah, so it's fun to see, from my point of view, where that history really impacts the storytelling, because I think that it's a little bit different with a franchise like this. Star Wars, it's space fantasy. It's this mythology. It's these big plot heavy stories where like it really just leans into those really like those mythic tropes, whereas for me personally, I see like something like Star Trek, something that's a little bit more quintessentially sci-fi. That to me is more of like the vehicle for exploring philosophical ideas. To me, Star Trek is the first episode of Next Gen where they get put on trial for the sins of humanity. Like that's the vehicle that I see for Star Trek, whereas Star Wars is just so plot heavy, and it's those stories that just kind of draw you in. It truly is our modern mythology, and so I mean, it really does. It has a power that I think
Yeah,
transcends a lot of other stories today.
yeah, yeah. yeah, and self-aware myth making, which is kind of
Mhm.
interesting. But again, I always maintain, the self-aware myth making part wouldn't work if the stories weren't super fun. When I sat down with Ryan Johnson to talk about the last Jedi novelization, he told me something that has become just a commandment of mine for storytelling, but I think is also a really, really great lens for Star Wars. He said that in talking about the story of the Last Jedi, he was like, "There's lots of heavy stuff in there, and really kind of moments that kind of hit hard and that are weighty." And he said, but he always made sure that you were just a scene or two away from something light and Flash Gordoning. And I
Mhm.
thought that was not only great advice for Star Wars and kind of a peek at the blueprint, but also just great advice for storytelling. Period. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I should really write that like above my desk here. But yeah, great commandment, and again, part of kind of the secret sauce.
Yeah. So how did it all begin? What was the first project? What was the first thing that got you working in this franchise?
I was a it was very funny. My friend Daniel Wallace, who I co-wrote the Essential Atlas with, he was somebody I knew on America Online message boards a trillion years ago. We're talking like kind of the early 90s. We were part of a little community, which a surprising number of people went on to do Star Wars stuff. It was actually pretty great. And uh, Dan was working on the Essential Guide to Planets and Moons, one of the kind of OG first generation essential guides from Del Rey. And I'd always been fascinated by Star Wars geography, and I'd kept like this big crazy list of the planets, etc. And but I didn't want Dan, who I didn't actually know, I'd never met him, to feel like I was stepping on his turf. So eventually gave it to him after his book came out, and he was like, why didn't you give this to me when I was working on the book? It would have been really useful. Like, what are you doing?" And so we got to be friends that way. And he had been obviously vetted by Lucasfilm, so he could write that. And he spoke up for me, and I actually got vetted to work on the old West End Games Adventure Journal
Okay.
series, which has a lot of kind of amazing lore in it, but was also a chance to be experimental. And it was also, I mean, really, now that I think about it, I haven't thought about this before, but it was actually the blueprint for what I've done since then. Like, it had short stories and lore, and it's kind of a bunch of wacky stuff too. So I got vetted to do that, and then West End Games, which actually weirdly was kind of financially an offshoot of a shoe company, like, it's very strange. Google it. Like, they got overextended and the company shut down, and I remember being crushed. I was like, that was my chance. I got vetted to do something, and now the company doesn't exist anymore, and that was it. I'm going to regret this forever. But Dan and I kept talking, and eventually I got a gig as the book columnist for the Star Wars Insider,
Okay.
um, which was amazing. And I got that not because I was a Star Wars fan, but because I was a journalist. I was working for the online arm of the Wall Street Journal at the time, so I had a track record in being able to write and being able to work with editors and hit deadlines and all that. But the insider gig was really fun. Like, every month I got to talk to a Star Wars author and take apart how they did what they did. Which for a budding writer was also a great way to pick fellow writers' brains and actually get paid for it.
Mhm.
And I just went from there. And eventually I think my first credit was for Wizards of the Coast. It's basically RPG stuff where I armed myself with my knowledge of first generation advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which was like hopelessly out of date. But so I would send in these stats and think, oh God, that's a total mess. And I think poor Wizards just like published them as is. So I don't know if any of that stuff was ever playable, but I did the best I could. And from there, I would do, I loved writing Star Wars and getting to contribute to that universe in any way that, if anybody had a gig for me, I'd take it. And eventually that led, the first kind of big book was DK asked me to do the first Clone Wars visual guide, which was ahead of the movie in the first series. Um, and that was really fun. And we just went from there. And the Essential Atlas followed, and eventually
That this one
I got. Actually, that's the
was
second
new.
or third one. Here, hang on, since we have visuals. Um, and eventually I did fiction, and everything kind of went from there. Oh God, I'm gonna find it in these shelves. Here, talk to me while I'm doing this foolish errand. Oh, here we go. That's the limited collector's edition. I don't know what
Oh,
that means.
wow. Yeah, I've never seen that one, but on Google
Oh, it's got
Images.
prints in the back. I totally forgot that.
Cool.
I should put it on eBay. No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't do that.
That's how I am too, I think. You collect these things, and I'm one of those collectors where I'm like, I collect for myself. Like, this is I can't imagine getting rid of the books and everything that I've gotten. So, but
Yeah,
yeah,
the
okay,
one
so
problem is I have a New York City apartment, so you can see like all this mess, and so everything kind of has to justify its square footage.
I
So
live in an I
occasionally
live in
I'm
an
like,
attic.
oh,
So probably the same thing. This
yeah,
is my
yeah, yeah,
corner, and this is kind of where everything has to stay.
yeah,
But we make the sacrifices.
exactly.
But okay, so that's really cool. So I love hearing that. What I thought was really interesting is to hear that even back then, early 90s, you were finding connections in those early online communities. That's stuff that I feel like, I mean, that's very much my experience, is growing up in those fandom spaces.
Yeah,
And even today, Discord, Tumblr, Twitter, of course, like all of these different places where people congregate kind of just to um be there for the love of this shared media.
yeah,
And it's just strikes me that like people have always started to seek each other out that way as soon as the technology was available. But it was so cool that like as you said, like in those early spaces, a significant number of you ended up actually being able to go on and contribute. That's pretty cool.
yeah. And I think we had all had the same experience. I mean, it was just such a miracle finding, people in this suddenly opened up virtual world who cared about the geeky thing you cared about. And I mean, that was so amazing. And I think such an experience for so many members of niche and then not so niche communities. Yeah, I mean, the whole world is open to you. I mean, for good and sometimes for bad, but yeah, it was just, oh gosh, it was, yeah. And actually I was, I'm a huge New York Mets fan, and I did the same thing. I was living down outside DC, and I would hang around on message boards with other Met fans, like commiserating. And one of those people is still one of my best friends. We write a blog together. So yeah, absolutely, absolutely formative in really wonderful ways.
So then in that, um you've seen this whole evolution of this internet culture.
Yeah,
And with it, of course, you've seen the changes in the ways that creators are able to interact with fans. And I mean, a lot of that I think has to do, there's not only the evolution of the technology that's available, things like Twitter kind of breaking down walls between fans and creators for good or for bad. But then also, I remember Sam Witwer saying something about how, in those early days, they really were, telling stories for themselves, being able to make the Clone Wars, especially with George Lucas's involvement, and, well received, but definitely not being taken notice of as it's airing.
yeah,
And it just strikes me then that like the fandom during that period, which for the majority of the culture, for the people who are just kind of like the casual Star Wars fans who go to the theater, they probably look at that era and be like, oh, well, there's nothing going on in Star Wars. I mean, what was coming out was animation. That's just for kids, right? And so like, you go from that, and then it's acquired by Disney, and then things just change at the same time that this internet culture is really flourishing in terms of a place for people to be able to meet, and not only just meet, on kind of private forums and servers and stuff, but very publicly with things like Twitter. So
Yeah.
how have you seen that evolution of fandom, and what have you enjoyed about the changes, and maybe what do you wish you could go back to?
Oh, I mean, that's a really interesting question. It's I suppose it's kind of like the parable that's not true about the the frog in the water that slowly starts to boil, so you don't kind of notice. In that, I mean, it was always a super gradual thing for me because I mean, dating back to AOL days, the level of engagement, kind of built slowly with each. I mean, I never did MySpace or anything like that, but it would build slowly with Facebook and Tumblr and Twitter, and then as well as outposts dedicated to Star Wars. I mean, I still have an account like on the Force.net message boards and things like that. Um, so I mean, that was interesting to see, and actually, in a weird way, kind of paralleled my career, going from doing more and more things, and and I don't like the word high profile because I've genuinely loved 99% of the things I've done, whatever they were. But it was certainly perceived that way. Um, I mean, fandom today is such an interesting thing. I mean, there are so many layers to it. I mean, there's a layer for people for whom Star Wars is a good grift. I mean, it's good culture war stuff, and you can get a rise out of people, etc. And I think I've blocked all those people because I just don't have time for that. And there's a kind of a clickbait layer where every little tidbit of information gets spun into kind of a useless article, and I don't really have much time for that because who does? Um, but below that, there's a huge level of fan engagement and creators, talking to each other and talking to fans, and I love it when all those lines get jumbled up as they should. And even then, there are people who love things, people who passionately hate things, etc. And there's still a lot of tumult there. But I feel like 99.5% of that stuff all comes from a place of love and engagement and wanting the best for something. And even the interactions where you kind of wish one party, or if not both, had taken a step back and done things a little differently. Like, they're generally coming from a place of passion, etc. And and that's great. And also, I mean, it's super important to remember, the touch grass thing is, most of the world is still lived outside these virtual communities, and it's the same thing. Like, 99.5% of my interactions out there at cons and book signings, et cetera, have been wonderful. And I've left them feeling super energized, et cetera. Even if they're with people whose, first thing is like, I really hated The Last Jedi or whatever, because, you got common ground and you talk, and the vast majority of times it's wonderful. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting, but I mean, I suppose the thing is, like, if you'd shown me what this world would be like I mean, gosh, on the AOL message boards, or even in the late 90s or the late aughts, I would have been like, that sounds really complicated and astonishing. I don't know if I'll be able to do that. But, we've all kind of gotten used to it and learned to find our way in it for the most part.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm sure that, you know, uh, as that evolution occurred, there I'm just kind of thinking at the end of the Clone Wars era. I know that there was a time when Dave Filoni was on Twitter. There was a time when those walls were even more broken down, before we had to deal with such an onslaught of people that it just kind of, it got easier for a number of people to just kind of retreat, and I certainly don't blame any of them. It's always surprising to me that there's still enough creators on Twitter, in general, because I'm like, I don't know if I would take that. But I mean, yeah, you have kind of been at the forefront. I mean, you wrote the novelization for The Last Jedi.
Mhm.
When you were writing it, did you have a sense that this was going to be as controversial as it became?
No, um, but it's not quite that simple. I actually read the script for The Last Jedi before I saw The Force Awakens. It's a very strange experience. Because at that point I was kind of plugged in ways that I no longer am, and so had a kind of a sense of what was coming. Um, and I remember I read it and I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff in it, but I didn't know how I felt about it at first. And I kind of needed some time to sit with that story and think about it a little. And over like, a week or two, I saw what it was trying to do and started to admire what it was trying to do. And was really struck by the ways in which it was finding new ground for Star Wars, while I thought thoroughly respecting what had come and using that as the building blocks of a story. So when it came out, I was surprised by I mean, look, it wasn't everybody, it wasn't even a majority of people, but I was surprised by the wing of people for whom it didn't work. Let's put it that way. But then I remembered that I had needed a little time to sit with that story too, and thought, everybody deserves that. And one of the unfortunate hallmarks of our era is that people have somehow got it into their heads they have to immediately have an opinion and react to things. And I think, some you kids out there, some underutilized phrases to try out. I don't know. I need to think about that a while. I'm not sure. That's
That's an interest
fine.
that's
We're
an
allowed to
interesting
do
opinion.
that. Um,
I
but
haven't thought about it that way.
yeah, exactly. I don't have an opinion. That one's also fine. So, I was like, everybody deserves some time to sit with this story. And one thing that was funny is that novelization was the first novelization that did not come out with the film, which usually meant a
Oh.
couple weeks before the film, which meant, everybody like, you could kind of spoil the movie by reading it, et cetera, and stuff would leak out of like the printing plants and all this stuff. But I remember I was very disappointed at first that my book was the first one that was actually going to come out with the DVD, because that seemed like an impossibly long time after the movie, and I was like, oh, we're going to lose our buzz and like bestseller ranking and blah, and all this nonsense. But I actually wound up feeling very lucky that that had happened, because I thought that was actually a really good time for it. It was actually a really good time for people who had loved the movie to want to engage with it again, and here was the novelization. And also, frankly, for people who the movie maybe hadn't worked for them in the theaters, to give the story another shot and think about it differently. And so, and some of my most rewarding interactions have been with people who were like, well, I didn't know how I felt about The Last Jedi at first, but I read your novelization and saw some stuff in it, went back to the movie and really enjoyed it more. Like, that's great. And that's something great that a novelization can do sometimes. So
And
that's a
that's
very rambling, complicated answer. No, I didn't see it coming, but in hindsight, I mean, it's a difficult movie. It's not an obvious popcorn movie. I guess the place where I differ from really fierce critics of The Last Jedi, and look, I respect their opinion. We're all entitled to it. Is that yes, The Last Jedi in some ways deconstructs Star Wars heroism and makes us question some things. It's not going to go the way you think. But at the end, the way I see it is that it's ultimately a reaffirmation of all those things. And the sequence that always gets it for me is Luke says, scornfully, almost spitefully to Rey, like, did you think I was going to take a laser sword and go out and face down the First Order myself? And in the end, that's exactly what he does. And the fact that he's a projection doesn't change that one bit in my mind. So, that kind of calculus makes the movie work for me and work really wonderfully well. But, I can see how it might not work for other people, and that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I remember feeling those very strong feelings, and it was really interesting because at that time, that was pre-pandemic, so that was, like, back in my casual fan days,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
even then, I remember having some very strong feelings about it, and, but for me, I think that, it kinda gets down to what we were talking about before, this idea of mythology. I think
Mhm.
that for me, the real difference is that subversion of it's it really is playing with that idea of mythos, and I just kind of feel like to me, when I watch then Rise of Skywalker, it's like I can see J.J. Abrams trying desperately to rewrite this train that's been blown off its tracks and say, "This is still mythology, this is still our story." And it's so interesting the way that, Rian Johnson wanted to subvert that, but like you said, like, still try not take away the power behind it,
Yeah.
but just kind of throw everybody on their heads a little bit, and I feel that. I appreciate it a little bit, but I feel that. But I appreciate that, with your novelization, which I'm going through right now, I have not finished it. But what I do really love is, like you said, there is a purpose that novelizations can have. I do think that I criticize the sequels a bit in terms of ended up being an awful lot of information that got given to fans in ways that were not on screen. And I kind of look at that and I'm just kind of like, ugh, what are we saying when we are telling our audience, like, you don't get the full experience unless what was it? There was something that came out in like a Minecraft game or something. There was
Fortnite.
something.
Yeah.
Fortnite, yeah, that's what it was. And that's where I'm like, I don't know really what that speaks to, but what I do love is that with things like novelizations, you're able to, I think, kind of smooth the edges. I think that, kind of in the same way that the prequels had such a rocky reception, and then, first off, over the years, in the same way that Ewan McGregor always talks about the fact that, like, the prequels were made for kids and that it's those kids who grew up with an appreciation for them. I think that everything, all movies, all initial reactions kind of get smoothed over a bit, because the fans who think that something doesn't fit eventually will give way to the people who it's always fit for them because they saw it all together.
Yeah.
But it is just really cool to see that, when you're able to take a novelization and you do such a nice job of not just translating what is on the screen from image to text, but also diving into the characters' psyches and getting their motivations and really giving people a reason for, like, why you can trust what you're seeing on screen. That's what I think is a hallmark of the best novelizations, and I've always felt like you do that just wonderfully. But what do you think makes for an effective novelization?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, The Last Jedi was such. I mean, I had done some Clone Wars novelizations, etc. So I wasn't brand new to it. But The Last Jedi was a special case because the director was also the writer. Um, and I mean, I agree. And actually, interestingly, one of the things that Ryan told me sitting with him is, as a kid, he would read the novelizations of movies he wasn't allowed to see, and so they were really important to him. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, why he met with me in the first place, because he cared about this, having had that experience. Another thing he did for me that was just extraordinary was he said, I'm going to give you access to all the previous iterations of the script, and anything you think you can use, go for it. Which is
Cool.
incredibly generous. A lot of creators would not have done that. He was just generous and kind from the start. He was like, if you're having any trouble, call me up, etc. Which I didn't do, because when I first met him, he was in the final stages of, like, I think the sound mix for Last Jedi, and then I was working on this like frantic pace. But I thought about it a couple times, but I was like, the man just made a Star Wars movie. I was like, let him rest. Leave the man alone. Like, if anyone deserves a break, it's Ryan Johnson. The other reason, though, that I really didn't have to bug him was, um, that script has never been published. But one of the things that's remarkable about it, it is very interior. A lot of the script describes exactly what characters are thinking, what they're feeling, etc., along with the action, which is not true in some scripts. And that's often one of the things that a novelization can do, but the novelization author may be missing. But it was pretty much all there. So I had the characters' motivations, where they were in their heads, et cetera, because Ryan had already given it to me. So that was interesting. The biggest challenge is actually the biggest challenge in that book by far was a really interesting scene. You know, the Rashomon scenes where you get Luke and Kylo remembering things, um, and then Ray is finally she's telling her experience in the cave, and it starts with her she's speaking into the camera, and you assume she's talking to Luke, and the surprise it's like a record scratch is she's talking to Kylo, and I was like, how in the world do you do that? How do I create that? Because it's entirely like a visual thing. Like we're going to switch perspectives, and oh, it's Kylo, it's not Luke. I was like, how do you do that in novelization? That was really, really hard. I didn't have an answer, and I walked around for like days trying to figure it out. So yeah, I mean, look back, the Rashomon scenes were, I knew how to do that. I was like, we're going to introduce each scene, and the language is going to be parallel, almost exact, and then the differences will stand out more. So that one I had down, but that how to recreate Ryan's using visual language to surprise the audience, that was a huge, huge challenge. So yeah, if you haven't read the novelization, read it and tell me tell me what you think of my idea. But beyond that, it was just fun. I mean, whether it was using, additional dialogue for particularly like Finn and Rose, I loved having more dialogue for them, or incorporating deleted scenes. Or, there were some scenes in there that either I wanted and thought up on my own, or, I talked through with Lucasfilm and we decided to do. I mean, it was just all a blast. It really was.
It must be a lot of fun to be able to be in that place where you get access to those things that I mean, like you said, there's no reason a creator has to show you early scripts or whatnot. You know that these
Yeah.
things are probably never going to see the light of day, and yet you get to not only enjoy them in their original, primary form, but then be able to translate some of that for other people's enjoyment too. So that's really exciting.
Oh yeah, no, it is amazing. I'll tell you two quick stories from that I find kind of entertaining. Though, one thing we didn't get to do, there was an earlier version of Rose and Finn finding the master code breaker, in which they actually go on a heist with him, and it like immediately goes wrong, and he gets like basically hauled off in a net by helicopters, and then they like close in and put Finn and Rose in jail. Like, it's the same kind of record scratch moment, and they wind up the same way they did. But I love that scene because there was a lot of physical comedy in it, and a lot of like kind of fun back and forth between Finn and Rose. And so I wanted to do that scene instead of the one in the movie. And we actually, so I wrote that, and it was in there until the last weekend. Like we were done. They were holding like printers to print this out, and I was like, yes, did it. And then, literally on the last weekend, somebody was like, I don't think a novelization should depart from, the movie story quite this thoroughly. So can you put that back? Which in hindsight was the right call. It was pushing it too far. So I don't bemoan the call at all, but that scene was really fun. So I'm waiting for some kind of anniversary where we can, find some place that'll publish the alternate version. Um, the Where was I going with this? Um, I don't remember if this is it, but it's oh yeah, no, I do remember. Sorry. So I did. The funny thing was, I was writing off the script, etc., and of course, hadn't seen the movie. But they did arrange a screening for me in November, before the movie came out in December, and it was like in Burbank, in like a Disney facility, and so I went down there and met some Lucasfilm people there, and it's a little screening room, and it's like I thought, are we going to be in a theater? Like, what's going to happen? You're just in a little screening room with a couple of seats, and it's pitch black. Like they just shut the lights off, and the movie starts, and it's pitch black. And I had a notebook with me, to write down, things I wanted to incorporate, figuring this was kind of a polish pass to get little things I didn't have. And within 10 minutes, I realized that the script I'd been working from was not the final script.
Mhm.
There had been another iteration. And actually, the whole first like 20% of the movie was sequenced utterly differently. And I was like, and kind of panicked there in the dark. And so I started frantically writing notes. And I got out of the theater and looked down at my notes. And because I couldn't see, like all the notes were basically on the same line. It was just this sea of ink and they were all useless. And so I just, kind of had to do the best I could. And somebody asked me, like, a couple of the kind of Luke speeches to Ray about like the Jedi texts, et cetera, and are not quite what's in the movie. And I'm like, I did the best I could. I couldn't read my notes in the dark. Sorry. But no, the whole experience was so much fun. And like I said, even the missteps and mistakes like that, I still enjoy. It was all part of kind of this crazy process and this great roller coaster ride.
Well, it strikes me too that it's a good reminder that this kind of work is very dynamic, and it's even in something like this where you are the sole writer of the novelization, it's a collaborative process.
Yeah,
And I think that there's very few art forms that are truly individualistic. I'm a theater person.
yeah,
Theater is, it's just inherently collaborative. Even one person shows cannot be truly
right.
one person shows. But that was another thing that I kind of wanted to talk about, both in terms of I don't remember how much you recall all of those novelizations that you did for Clone Wars, but I mentioned that I'm a really big fan of the one that you did of the Lawless arc in season 5 with Maul's Revenge and Mandalore and
Shadow conspiracy.
Shadow Conspiracy.
Is that what it
Yes.
is? Yeah.
Yes, that's it. And that one, I mean, first off, I have to say the book is very well received, and we quite love it over on the Obatine Discord server. So they're very excited for this. You are still currently, I believe, the only person who has written Satine from her point of view. We got a little bit of her
Oh
in
wow, is that true?
yeah, we got a little glimpse of her in Brotherhood, which came out last year.
Ah,
But that is still the only time that she's been able to have content in text from her point of view. And
well, that's
I just
tragic. We need more
I know.
Satine point of view.
That's what I'm saying.
Like it doesn't even
That's
have to be me. Like let's let a bunch of people do that. That'd be wonderful.
I agree. But to be fair, you are still first on my list of who I want to see ever tackle like a novel of Obi-Wan and Satine on the run or things like that.
Oh,
So
thank you. That'd be so much fun.
that would be a lot of fun.
I love Dave Filoni. He's been a godsend for Star Wars, and as a fan, I am so happy with everything he's done. The fact that he is still doing it, but that was a super fun book. But it's interesting. We've been talking about kind of differences. Looking back on the differences there, kind of in the experience were great. Like the Clone Wars scripts talk about collaborative processes too. I mean, all those episodes are such wonderful collaborations between Dave, the writers, the animators, the cinematographers, etc., that it's interesting to look back at the scripts compared to the finished product and see how they evolved. But like for instance, there's not very much in the kind of Maul Pre Vizsla fights in terms of direction. I mean, it's basically kind of they fight because you didn't need to script that. They would figure it out collaboratively, and it's wonderful. I mean, I think it's one of the best saber fights in Star Wars, frankly, including the movies and everything else. And all came from Dave and his team doing amazing work together. But as a novelizer, that was a huge challenge because then, there wasn't footage, there wasn't previs to see or anything like that. So I had to kind of figure out how to navigate that. And the way I did it was like, I can't capture the kinetic excitement of a lightsaber fight on the page. It's kind of not going to work. So I kind of rooted it in the characters, kind of where are they? What are they trying to do? Are they surprised? Can they feel themselves losing, et cetera? I thought that was the way into it. The other thing I was thinking about with the Clone Wars, there's that the wonderful episode, whose name I shamefully forget, with Ventress on the kind of quartz underground planet. Um,
Mhm.
with the train and the Kagi hostages, and that episode in script form read like kind of a train caper, and I was like, okay. But when you see it, it is so amazing and visually striking. And the characters like Highsinger, the bounty hunting droid, is one of the most amazing characters in Star Wars, and the fighting, but also just the mood of it, the colors, etc. I mean, it's one of my favorite episodes in the Clone Wars, but you'd never know from the script. Not that the script was bad, the script was obviously great, but the script was a starting point for, as you say, this kind of amazing collaboration. So, I mean, that was so much fun to see, and so much it's so amazing to see develop. But yeah, no, those experiences definitely do sum it up how much this has changed.
For sure. And interesting that in both of these books, you're kind of pulling out um these these moments where it's not a one-to-one translation. There is
Yeah,
stuff that you can do on screen that you cannot do the same way in text, and vice versa. I mean, that's why a
yeah,
script often doesn't have everything in there, because like you said, the the visuals happen in just
yeah.
a different form. So
Actually, sorry if you'll indulge me. There's one more funny thing I remember from that. In Shadow Conspiracy, I really wanted to see Anakin hand over the Twilight to Obi-Wan. I was like, why isn't that in there? Like, come on, I want to see that. I want to see that. And I had no idea that they had actually scripted that. And then I think, they'd cut it before whatever got to me. And it was only, I think, a year ago or so that we actually got to see a previs of that scene, and get to hear what they were saying to each other. And that was, as someone who had imagined that with no references, that was really fascinating to watch. Like a
okay.
storyteller I immensely respect, how are they going to do it? And then compare it to mine. So that was a lot of fun.
Okay, I might have to send you a post, because I've done a kind of an in-depth look into the differences between those two scenes.
Oh, really?
I'm somehow shocked and not shocked that you didn't really have, like, I figured that that was just in the original script, because I mean it does seem like the final was definitely going through previs. I mean, the actors hadn't recorded the lines, but like it was far
Yeah,
enough along that I just assumed that it probably was in there. But the mood is very, very different,
yeah,
and I really appreciate that yours is very much this understanding of, like, Obi-Wan recognizes that he can't bring Anakin with him, like, he has to do this alone. He doesn't want to get Anakin in trouble, whereas I'm not as big of a fan of the deleted scene that we see, where it's played a little bit more lighthearted and humorously, where, like, it's like Anakin doesn't really get how heavy this situation is. And so I love that scene. That's probably my favorite scene of the entire novelization, and it's precisely because I just love seeing that connection between Obi-Wan and Anakin.
oh, thank you. No, it's yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot of fun, but the whole thing was fun. I mean, I'm mad at Dave about that one thing, but thank God for Dave Filoni. I mean, he's just, I'm always so thrilled to see what he's going to work on next.
Yeah,
I'm not
it's
even that mad.
of course. But yeah, but before we change the topic, I just have to gush a little bit too about, it is really interesting to see again that dynamism, like, as these things are changing, because like Satine's final words are completely different. And I've written a little bit on that too, like how intriguing it is that, like, in that final scene what we see is her focusing on Obi-Wan. She tells him that she's always loved him, that she always will, and that's the moment that we're left with, which is s- such an intriguing moment in and of itself, because I feel like you have to pair that with the fact that, like, her last words to him are "I love you and I always will," and Anakin's last words to him are "I hate you."
Mm,
And it's just like that. that moment where it's like he's lost both of these people who are just these experiences are so different. But I actually really do love what's in the novelization, which is that she doesn't really focus on him, not at least not in terms of like her final words. She says something like basically remain true to yourself because I always did. And like maybe I'll have to find it, but like it's really an interesting choice for um just a second here. Um she says, "Remember, my dear Obi-Wan, no matter what, don't let go of what you believe in. I never did." And I've always thought that like I really do like that one too because they're both characters who have so much integrity.
Yeah.
And I like that it's that moment where you kind of see that like this is like the first big loss for him at the end of like at the start of Revenge of the Sith. Like this is like I mean I think that this is like the first big thing that happens in the year 19 BBY. It's kind of the death knell of peace in the
Yeah.
galaxy.
Yeah.
And it just kind of strikes me that like he's going to go through all of these losses and he never does fall. He never loses that integrity that he has, and I love that she's the one who tells them that she held fast, he needs to hold fast, and he does.
It's also I did not know the Elizabeth the First thing, but that feels very Elizabeth the First. So
Yeah, I
kind of
mean,
lucky there.
apparently it's Elizabeth the First, but it's Kate Blanchett's Elizabeth the First. It's the
Right.
two movies that came out, which was always really interesting because the first movie that she did came out 1998, so right around Phantom Menace, so right around when she would have been kind of the same age Satine was, and then the second one came out just as they were starting Clone Wars, which again like works out just really perfectly. And so
Right.
that was golden age. And so like yeah, I mean so interesting, very fascinating the way that they kind of adapted like the movie itself. You can, if you watch it, which it's a little mature, don't watch it with the kids around. But it's really interesting because it's there are scenes, there are full lines of dialogue that just sound like they're coming directly out of Satine's mouth, and it's very much playing with that idea like strip away the cultural context, you can see why it would have inspired something, this Catholic Protestant divide
Yeah.
going into this pacifist Death Watch divide, where there's just so much difficulty of like, how do we live together? Like,
Right.
how do we pursue a culture? The reason why I have always felt so strongly. I mean, I love Pre Vizsla as a villain, and the reason I love him is because you kind of get it. You get that he's this person who really cares about Mandalore, and he just has a very different view. I always love that, like in one of the behind the scenes features, Dave talks about how they gave him this look of a hero. They just gave him this,
Yeah.
tall and lean with this, this kind of wavy blonde hair, and it was all because he is the hero of his own story.
Got the little Superman spit curl and yeah.
Yep, exactly, and giving him
Yeah.
a
Oh,
name.
it's genius. I'd never heard that. But yeah, totally.
And even the name Pre was supposed to kind of recall words like preeminence, kind of like first, like he's the hero of this. So, um, yeah, no, I always felt like the Mandalore story, especially that we saw in the Clone Wars, and now even into Rebels and Mando, just it to me, I don't know what it's what made the whole world come alive, but that in and of itself has that same kind of mythological feel, almost like a story of like biblical epic kind of
Yeah.
proportions
Yeah. Yeah.
that I associate with the Jedi as well. But I don't know, just something that has been that for some reason is the thing that has had the staying power for me. And actually, while we're on that topic, what I also wanted to bring up was
Got my
um,
delivery.
oh, nice.
Sorry
And
for any munching.
well, if you shouldn't have it if you can't share. So,
Go ahead, Jessica. I cut you off. Sorry.
oh, not at all. But talking about Pre Vizsla, this is such a fun book. This is the Bounty Hunter Code, and to our listeners, if you've never picked up some of these books that are, they're made to be in universe kind of guides, like they're just so interesting because like at the end of this, like obviously lots and lots of stuff about different bounty hunters, but at the very end we've got this kind of like Death Watch propaganda, this manifesto. And this is what gets me as somebody who loves history, as somebody who loves theater. Like, I think the thing that I love so much about this book and this section in particular is that it's just so efficient in terms of just conveying all of this information about this fictionalized world. It bills itself as this kind of like, primary document of historical significance. It's got all of this stuff that, a lot of stuff kind of being either pulled from, inspired by, or subverted by legends.
Yeah.
So interesting. But then the other thing that I really love is that in these books, you get other characters, specifically in this case from the Clone Wars era and later, who act like they're reading this book, and then you get their little notes in the
Yeah.
the margins. And the thing that, like, the one that really I think is kind of cool is that there's one page as you're going through this Death Watch manifesto, and it's written as if it's being written by Tor Vizsla, who is, again, Legends character who
Yeah.
currently is not canonized. But then I love that you get Django's note that says, I wonder if Vizsla really wrote this. He was a thug. Sounds more like a priest or a Rao. Maybe the younger Vizsla. He seems to like speeches. And I love that, because there's so much information there that just kind of feels like you're kind of treasure hunting through like Django's ideas of like, what would Django know about these people? But then like going from Tor Vizsla to, I mean, I'm assuming that younger Vizsla is Pre. Is
Oh,
that,
Jessica, you froze.
oh, am I back yet?
Yeah, you're back.
All right. Thought we were going to get through an episode without any freezing. But yeah, that comment, I just think that it's just so fun, because what you're seeing is really, Django's thoughts on
Yeah.
these different people. I'm assuming that younger Vizsla is supposed to be Pre, unless I'm missing somebody else in that. But it just kind of fun, because it's not really saying it is; it's just suggesting it.
Yeah.
And it just strikes me as this really great way to kind of weave this tapestry. And as a historian, I appreciate it all the more, because we have so much of that where it's like you don't get all the answers given to you.
Yeah.
So much is conjecture, so much is interpretation, and you have to kind of be left with like, okay, so like you have this document. What if Django's right? What if part of it was written, previously? And in my head, what I think of is like Pre-Vizsla writing the rest of the manifesto, especially when you start to get the mentions of Satine, because obviously Tor Vizsla wouldn't have been around at that point, but writing as if he is Tor, and writing as if he's trying to continue that authoritative voice.
Yeah.
And so yeah, please pick up this book. It is such a good read, and there's several others, Sith, Jedi. What other ones have been done? There've been a couple of them.
Yeah, no, it's you touched on something that's really fun in working in lore and kind of creative ambiguity. Kind of one of the things you learn really quickly with Star Wars. Randy Stradley of Dark Horse Comics was the first one I heard say this, which was when you define, you confine. So it was the idea of kind of leaving things open-ended, so you're not cutting off other storytellers' narratives. But there can be, like you say, there can be so much fun in that, in kind of pointing at things, suggesting things, but kind of leaving things ambiguous. And things like the margin notes really work for that. Yeah, no, that was a super fun book. I got called in pretty late on that one. Dan Wallace and my dear friend Ryder Wyndham were working on it, and I think needed somebody to kind of jump in and take on some of the word count, and I was happy to do it because it was Mando stuff, and I thought it'd be really fun, and I wanted to work with them, and just away we went, and had a ball with it.
Well, I think it's funny because I've seen people who, like I said, as a historian, I look at this and it's like I get exactly what you're going for with these kinds of primary documents, that ambiguity, and the fact that like you're not supposed to be able to pin everything down. And
Yeah.
then I've seen people take this and like use it as like an argument against the pacifists, and I'm like, it's propaganda. I need you to understand that it is meant to be in-universe propaganda. And I think that I mean, there's even been fabulous book that Pablo Hidalgo did on Star Wars and propaganda and all of those in-universe elements, which again, just to me as a historian, just makes this world just sing with a reality that
Yeah,
not every franchise has, because it just feels like something that you would see in our world today.
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. And it's also, it's just really fun to do. I did it in, I wrote a solo tie-in, Tales from Vandor, which is all this kind of tall tales that might get told in the bar, and it's
Yeah.
solo. And oh my God, that was such a blast because it's literally just, you're just making stuff up. And I brought in, stuff from Legends. I brought in stuff from Han Solo at Star's End, which is my favorite Star Wars book, hands down, Legends or New Canon. I brought in Dash Rendar just as a joke, which, reliably every 10 days, somebody like on Twitter brings up that I brought back Dash Rendar, and they're like either thrilled and want to like shake my hand, or they're like horrified and want to smack me. But either way, I'm like, it's a reaction. That's great. As well as just making stuff up. But you never know where that goes. I did that in Ray's Survival Guide too. Like Ray's Survival Guide is this crazy tall tale about the emperor like burying all this secret stuff in the Jakku deserts. And then that turned into a major plot point in the Aftermath trilogy and has informed like the First Order and the Unknown Regions. So you never know. But I mean, that's part of the fun of being a Star Wars storyteller, whether it's a little story or a big one, is that the vast majority of authors treat it like a common sandbox, and you've been
Yeah.
given free reign to play with like greatest toys ever. But we all understand it's not. They're not our toys, and you got to share them. You can't take them with you when you leave. Somebody else is going to pick them up and do something else with them, and that might be what you have in mind, and it might not be. And but either way, that's what's going to happen. And there's a generosity to that I think is really kind of amazing, and it's great to be a part of. And I hope it comes across as fun to the readers who see the end product. And not only that, but see the stories kind of seed each other and inform each other over time.
I can't imagine it's entirely without the kind of stress and strain of it's not easy to play in a common sandbox all of the time. So especially as you're working on, I mean, I suppose for you, when you've worked collaboratively on projects, it's often nonfiction related.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a little bit easier to break up and work on individual pieces. I was able to um talk, High Republic with Kevin Scott a while back.
Mhm.
And that's something that I'm really fascinated about, is that idea of being able to have a common sandbox when you are trying to tell these huge stories. I mean, not to derail back to the sequels, but kind of, I see a similarity in terms of like having different writers, different directors for a three-part story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And things can be, there's a whole spectrum of like, how well can it be done, how cohesive can it be. But the thing that strikes me is that I don't know if you can say that it's a natural process. You would never look at something like Lord of the Rings and be like, oh yeah, it makes sense to me that three different authors wrote the three different books. Like we would look at that and we'd be like,
Yeah.
it would be more cohesive if one person took care of it.
Yeah.
So, in your experience, when you've been in these situations where you are very much aware that this is a common sandbox and that for whatever reason there's something that kind of strains that, how do you deal with that?
Look, we're all human, so you certainly get attached to characters that are dear to you, particularly if they're your own creations. And sure, it can be, you definitely, if you're reading something and somebody is taken something you introduced and run with it, you definitely kind of lean forward and are like, how's this going to go? It hasn't happened that much to me with characters. It's more concepts, but I mean, there are different ways of approaching it. I mean, the first and most important thing is you kind of know that's the ground rules when you're going in.
Yeah.
And, if you're not, it's kind of like being tall enough for this ride. Like, you know it from the start and you can kind of make your decision there. Um, but I'll also, whenever I can, I'll go out of my way to try to make sure character works for someone. Like I did a Ray Sloan short story. I ran that story by John Jackson Miller, who had introduced Sloan to us, make sure it kind of tracked with how he saw the character, which there was some professional courtesy in that, but it was mostly trying to serve fans and readers and make sure that I got it right. I did the same thing with Claudia Gray has a wonderful kind of cameo character, the Contessa, who I
Yes.
wanted to use in the Empire Strikes Back from a certain point of view story with Wedge. Like
Mhm.
I thought she'd be a great character to kind of smack Wedge into and see what happened. But that meant I also wanted to explore her backstory a little, and there I really wanted to run that by Claudia and make sure she was cool with that. So you do some of that, but again, it was mostly to just kind of make sure you're not foreclosing something in the storytelling, and you're doing justice to those characters. But it's also just really fun. I mean, my goodness. I mean, you know, when characters show up or concepts show up that you had something to do with in some other thing, it's just amazing. Like I tell a story all the time, like, you know, if I left it up to the collective to inscribe my gravestone, it would probably say like, I told you should have checked the Western Reaches. Because I made those up for the Essential Atlas, just to kind of fill out the galaxy with like geographic stuff. And then there's Harrison Ford saying it on screen.
That
And
is so cool.
yeah, I was like, are you kidding me? Like, really? And that's something that's a pinch me moment I'll have for my entire life. And that Hux's dad shows up on TV, a character, that I, kind of did a lot with in Servants of the Empire. And there he is, talking about his program and stuff like that. I mean, that's just amazing. And it's personally gratifying, but it's also, it's just so much fun to be a part of this giant tapestry and know that there are all these threads getting added to it all over the place.
It's a good reminder then that while there can be that tension and it's not easy to always share, there's also the joy then when those moments, when they are picked up by other people. And it's fun that you aren't the one who, like, the character or the concept doesn't have to live and die with you, but when somebody else picks it up, you can see how it has been woven in to everybody else's collective understanding.
Yeah, no, it's great. And once again, I had I co-write a Mets blog,
Mm.
and I promise this is going somewhere. I co-write a Mets blog, and when I was a kid, everybody thought I would be a sports writer. So I love baseball, I love the Mets. I was a decent journalist, and that seemed like the career path. And I decided not to do that because I learned early on that one of the cardinal rules of sports writing is you are not a fan. Like you are a
Mm.
neutral observer, and you do not, the line is there's no cheering in the press box. And I did not want to do that. I did not want to stop being a Mets fan, and there was no way I was signing up for that. So I didn't. When I got the chance to work on Star Wars, that was very much in my mind. I thought, if this works out, I'm going to know how the sausage is made. I'm going to see
Yeah.
behind the scenes. I'm going to know stuff. And it's entirely possible that, I will, that'll make it somewhere between hard and impossible to be a fan of this franchise that means the world to me. And I thought long and hard, do I really want to do that? And obviously I did it. But the wonderful outcome of that is that I love Star Wars far, far more for seeing how it's put together. And it goes back to that generosity and the fact that, I've literally never met anyone involved with it for whom it was a paycheck, a widget, etc. Like no, I've never met anyone who doesn't genuinely love it and want to do right for it. And that's such a great starting point. And I think there are lots of franchises that can't say that. But it's amazing, and it's amazing and humbling to be a part of. But it makes me happy as a creator, as a writer, but also as a reader and as a fan, which I, have never stopped being and never will stop being.
Well, and you've certainly been able to leave your mark with all of these different, we've talked about novelizations. Now, you've written junior novels with,
Yeah.
have you written adult novels?
I've not written an adult novel that's not a novelization.
Okay.
That's kind of the biggest thing on my bucket list is I would love to do that. And and I have some characters I would love to dive into. So maybe someday. But there are a huge number of people who want to do that. And if I get my chance, I will be ecstatic. But if not, I will be, ecstatic reading all the great books out there. Including, I'm about to dive into this one.
Yes,
My
so
friend
exciting.
Delilah. Really excited. Have you read this?
Not yet.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. I mean, look at this. So, how cool is this?
It's so
And
cool.
Star Wars does that all the time. So
Awesome. Well, yeah, well, you'll have to put Obi-Wan and Satine on that list just for me because
yeah, definitely.
that's I think that would be a great novel, and to do it at a level beyond the junior novelizations would be
Yeah.
fabulous. So, but then I mean, yeah, you've kind of got that divide between like there are specifically like reference books,
Mhm.
like the character encyclopedia for Clone Wars,
Yeah.
which that's fun. I mean that you did both of them, right? You
Yeah.
originated it and then did the update after season 7. I mean, how big of a project was that?
The update was really interesting because I mean the original, it was sorry, more props. Um like the original was super fun and I love this book, but it was fairly early on in Clone Wars. And I remember one funny exchange with that I had with the editors was, God, there are about 20 clone pilots in there.
I know.
And about Clone Pilot 10, I was like, I have nothing I can say about these clone pilots. They're literally the same person. They're quite literally the same person. Like, what do you want me to say? They fly a fighter and they die. That's what they do. But so by the time we got to upgrade it for Join the Battle, like there were so many more characters that we were
Mm.
able to, we had such a broader range to choose from that was great and a huge relief. But also, like just changing it up so we could also, not everybody needed a whole page. We could do little capsules, etc. That was great. Plus, it was just such a blast to kind of go through, my memories of the entire show and like writing even this little capsule biography of a minor character would remind me of that episode and that arc and all those connections and make me want to dive back into the show all over again, which I mean is really what a Star Wars book should do. It should make you, it should leave you with like, a big list of things you want to check out, not as homework, but because it sounds
Yeah.
really fun, whether those are movies or shows or other books or comics or what have you.
So when you do that, do you start basically just with like do you start with a rewatch on your own, or are you starting with things like Wikipedia, or how do you go about holding all of that information in your mind as you kind of plan this this encyclopedia that can't say everything. It can't have everybody in there, but it
Yeah.
also has to be comprehensive.
Well, as you say, every a book, even something where only one person has their name on the cover, which is so unfair, is a collaboration. So, for those books, I mean, there was, terrific editors at DK. I mean, David Fenneman was the editor on the Clone Wars book. You've got wonderful collaborators at DK, at whatever your publisher is at Lucasfilm, who are going to help you through that. Um, so it was a lot of fun, picking characters and making sure you have the whole range, leaving room for favorites you might just want to put in, places where you can expand the lore somewhere. Like, is there a character who doesn't have a name, which might be fun to do, etc. But then also just kind of, thinking about, what's this character's purpose? What do you want to say about them? What's the feeling you want from this? But one of the great things about being a Star Wars author, working in lore, is that every project is different. Like I've worked on projects that arrive pretty heavily outlined, and you're kind of filling in the blanks. I mean, sometimes literally like books like this, it's always kind of interesting. They show up with this sort of pig Latin,
Mhm.
um, and then you kind of replace it and make the lines scan, etc. And then there are books that are totally open ended, like Essential Guide to Warfare started out. That was originally going to be the Essential Guide to the Military. Karen Travis was going to write it, and then she and Star Wars kind of parted ways, and the book kind of got passed over to me. But that was really all there was. And I wanted to reimagine that book, for a couple of reasons. One was I had my own ideas about um, approaches I thought would be fun to take, and I wanted to create some distance there. Like, I didn't want people to get the book with the title of Karen's book, and then because I knew immediately they would, as we all do, they would like compare it to whatever they had in their minds about what Karen's book would have been. And so, we got to start kind of totally fresh there around that basic concept, and go from there. But I love that there's a huge range there. Sometimes, you're kind of, the music is written and your job is to kind of, learn the dance moves and make them work. And sometimes it's like completely open ended and you just kind of go. But again, always with a team helping you out.
I think that that's something that is it still strikes me as really strange that in the past there has been a pretty significant divide between the idea of, I just think about the idea of like fan fiction and that kind of stuff where it's like it always struck me as a little bit funny that there used to be this divide between like you've got fiction writers, you got the people who are creating their own worlds and their own stories, and then you have the people who they can't do that or they don't want to do that. They just want to use other people's characters. And it
Mhm.
always struck me as kind of funny that like these kinds of tie-in novels, these tie-in books, they're not new. They've been around for literally generations.
Mhm.
Today, I feel like there is a bit of that wall being dismantled when we see things like, I mean, we've got a number of books that have made the jump from Raylo fan fiction into um, real published works.
Yeah.
Um, and I wonder, is that changing at all in publishing as people are looking at it like because to me, I've always seen it as even more impressive when, maybe you start out writing fan fiction, but it's the mark of being able to take already created characters in an already existing universe and write in the sandbox. You're playing in the sandbox, you're within those parameters. So the goal, and I think the kind of the ingenious part of it, is that the success comes from being able to seamlessly meld a story into something that is already created. What are your thoughts on, either that divide between those, or like, the way that people today are looking at um kind of that divide between straight fiction and IP.
Um, I don't know. That's an interesting one. I mean, it's funny. Like, I came up as a writer, fan fiction was still sort of verboten. Like, you didn't,
Yep.
if you graduated, like, you didn't talk about it. You certainly didn't call attention to what you did. And I mean, those walls are down
Yeah.
thoroughly. And I think it's great that they are. I mean, like Claudia is a great example of someone
Mhm.
who, you know, um, really kind of learned to hit all her marks, as far as I know, on fan fiction, and Star Wars writers who still write it, because they love to, and that's great. I mean, I think the amazing thing there that I think is so important for writers is just presenting your stuff to an audience and learning how it's received, and taking that into account. I mean, I think that's absolutely critical to any writer, and fan fiction is an amazing way to do that. Um, and for me, that's not. I mean, I think the real advantage there, and is that. I mean, I imagine it's pretty hard to go out on the internet with wholly original stuff and get somebody to read it and critique it. But if you're in a sandbox that people know and love, then that's a great way to do it. And my God, I mean, what a great tool for a writer, as well as so much fun.
I've
Um,
I've recommended that to so many people
yeah,
because you know that you're going to have already created interest
Yeah,
in what you're writing.
yeah. But, just, be ready for it. There are people who are not gonna like what you do, and they're gonna let you know, and that's okay. Start developing your rhino skin early because you're gonna need it. But yeah, I mean, it also it jives with something I tell, I do classroom visits and stuff that I tell people all the time. Like, if you've written something and shared it with someone and taken in their reaction, you're a writer. Like,
Yeah.
that's the test. I don't, you don't, it's not if you can go to like Barnes and Noble or Amazon and find a book by you. That's no, no, no. That's a that's a subset of writing. But if you've done that, if you've written something, shared it with someone, got a reaction, you're a writer. And I firmly believe that. And there are so many more ways to do that now, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. Um,
Well, and I'll just mention that as someone in publishing, I think that that's even more true because in today's day and age, like it's hard. It is hard to get published. It's
yeah,
hard to make a living as an author.
yeah,
It's hard that often published authors are the ones who already have a social media following. And it's like you really have to get into that mentality of like, why do you write? And a
yeah,
writer is someone who writes because they can't not write. And if that's you,
yeah,
then you're a writer, no matter if you have something published, no matter if you make your living doing it, you are a writer.
yep. No, absolutely. And it's a good place if you forgive me for my little PSA. I got so many questions on this that I eventually just put it on my Substack because I thought it would be useful. Is one of the things I get all the time is, I want to write Star Wars. How do I do that? And
Mhm.
similarly, what I tell people is, don't try to do what I did, because I think I could rerun the script 100 times and it wouldn't ever work. I got to write Star Wars because I was a journalist. That's why.
Yeah.
Um, I could work with others. I could hit my deadlines, etc. The fact that I was also a huge Star Wars fan was a coincidence. In fact, if anything, huge fandom can kind of get in your way, because it can make people rigid, and rigidity is not going to work in writing, because, as we've been discussing, it's so collaborative, and there's some give and take there, and you have to be able to do that. But what I tell people is, as you say very well, write because you love it. That's right, because you have to, because that's what's going to sustain you. And that can be existing IP, or that can be a local newspaper, or it can be your own creations, whatever it is. But write because you love it, and be willing to work on that, and be willing to find the time and stay up late and everything else and keep going and do that. And that's the part you can control. And everything else, whether it's your own creations, and I know this all too well, or IP, like, you cannot control things at a certain point very soon after it leaves your hands. You can't control how it'll be marketed, how it'll be packaged. You certainly can't control how it'll be received.
Yep.
The part you can control is the work, the imagining, and the work, and the enjoyment of it. And so I just tell people, do that, and then do that, let it be its own reward, and eventually, maybe, if some things line up in ways that it's very hard to make happen, like, maybe the stars align and you can write Star Wars, or whatever IP it is. But if you go into that as the starting point, I mean, it's a recipe for disappointment. Not because you're not good, you may well be, but because so many things outside your control have to work.
Yeah. And that's the thing too is that again, being in publishing, just looking at the numbers, I have had friends who have kind of lamented like, "Oh, I'd love to write, I'd love to get published." And I'll tell them, make sure you're doing it not, because you want to make a profit, but because you have something more because it might not happen.
Yeah,
But even beyond that, like I've looked at people's like numbers on their fan fictions and I'm like, "I need you to understand that you have more eyeballs on your work now
yeah,
than 98% of people who get published." And part part of that is like I feel like people don't really recognize that. I think that,
yeah,
people generally if they don't know publishing, they do just think that like, "Oh, it's like any other, professional work. You do it and you are getting paid and you are getting paid well." And unfortunately, like that's just not how it always happens. So it's one of those things where you kind of have to interrogate yourself and say like, what is my measure of success here? Why am I doing it? And then I think that when you do look at things like that, sometimes it does actually give you a reason to kind of push even more into those volunteer but really meaningful opportunities like fan fiction, where if you know that like you're getting your community through that, if you know that you're making people happy and they're actually able to leave comments and tell you that, you don't get comments usually on books that just go out the door, bound with paper and ink. Like
Yep.
now you might get that based on a social media presence, but I just think that like some people like fan fiction is not something to thumb your nose at, because there really are benefits to being able to have that in with the people that you want to create for.
Yep. Nope. That's perfectly said. Absolutely.
So yeah, so fascinating. I mean, I really appreciate that. There's so much here. Just that kind of hyper focus when it's like you get into this one world. Well, there's something for everybody, whether you are interested in fan fiction or you're interested in. I mean, you see all of the YouTube videos and you see the creators of different kinds of things. um I don't know, for you, you've done the reference books. Do you see a difference between like reference and nonfiction? I'm thinking of things like, the difference between the encyclopedias and the timelines, as opposed to things like, Bounty Hunter's Code or things like that, where it's like it's not really a reference book per se, but it's not quite fiction either. It's kind of somewhere like in the middle, where it's like you're contributing the nonfiction, you're contributing to this world,
Yeah.
but it's somewhere in the middle. Do you see a difference between all of those things, or do they all just kind of mesh together?
It's, I mean, it's a spectrum, certainly. I mean, I think all reference books work better um, if there's at least a nominal kind of in-universe starting point. I
Mhm.
mean, both for plausible deniability, creative ambiguity. Like I said, I mean, you can't be crazy about that. Like, I mean, you mentioned Star Wars Timelines, my latest book. I mean, this amazing collaboration with this kind of dream team of authors that I loved for DK. But like, that book frankly would have been really annoying in the style of the Bounty Hunters Code. Like if,
Oh yeah.
there's margin notes. No, that's not what I want in a in a book called Timelines. So there's definitely, there are lines kind of not to cross there. But at the same time, like, I mean, it's Star Wars. It's super fun. And like we said, the whole idea is to get people to want to engage with it more. So, to me, like an absolutely like cold, flat, just the facts treatment of Star Wars. I mean, I don't think that particularly works. But I don't think any of the reference books I worked on were like that. And maybe the RPG stuff a little in the beginning, but it's kind
Maybe.
of its
Yeah.
own animal.
What is the stuff that you particularly love to work on? Characters, eras, like what is the thing where it's like that's what I want?
Oh, well, I mean, this will sound like a cop out, but I mean, the joy of Star Wars is that, it's there's something to love everywhere.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, I like to say, what are we up to now? 11 movies? Is that right? And how wonderful it is that I've got to like kind of do the math in my head as opposed to being like, there are three. What are you talking about? Um, but I like to say, kiddingly but truthfully, that Attack of the Clones is my 11th favorite Star Wars movie. When there's a new one, I'm pretty sure Attack of the Clones will be my 12th favorite Star Wars movie.
Hey, now we're gonna have to revamp that.
You get where I'm going. But,
Yeah.
I have done a lot of work on a lot of books that is drawn heavily on Attack of the Clones, and I've had a blast doing that. It is so much fun. So, even something that doesn't necessarily connect with me the way the other 10 do, um, is still so much fun. So, I never limit myself in Star Wars that way because, I mean, if that's true, you know, everything is true. That said, I grew up with the original trilogy. Han Solo is my favorite character as a kid. The number one thing on my list, if I ever got to do it, would be a Han novel, which I would just love to do.
Yes.
I'd love to do like a Jabba the Hutt novel, kind of talented Mr. Ripley style, where like, the psychotic villain is the protagonist and you realize you're rooting for the wrong person. And how do you do that? I think it'd be a lot of fun. I'd love to write a Tally Lintra book. I actually outlined a Tally Lintra kind of origin book that I thought would be amazingly fun to do.
You do know that there's someone on Twitter who's gonna be very excited that you said that, right?
Oh, I do, believe me. Believe me. Yeah, yeah, we have the same interests in mind. But if it's not me, it should be somebody because I want to read that book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there's so many characters like that that I would love to see. The Han thing is actually a funny, quick story. I wrote the we'll do props again. I wrote the Weapon of the Jedi, which by the way
Mhm.
is the secret prequel to the Last Jedi novelization. I could not have written that novelization without this book because the Force is essentially a character in this book, and I feel like
Mm.
if I did my job, it is in the Last Jedi novelization too. But there's a direct through line between those two books that I found really rewarding. But so Weapon of a Jedi came out in the run up to Force Awakens, and it has this kind of frame story for Force Awakens around it. And um, I was asked if I wanted to write this, and it was going to be the first, Luke Skywalker's first new canon lightsaber duel. I was like, sure, of course, because why wouldn't it? But the thing that I was immediately struck by is I'd never really been a Luke guy.
Mhm.
Like I didn't really quite feel like I got the character, and I was more a Han guy. I was like, I thought Luke should have like run off with Han and been a space pirate because it sounded way more fun than like hanging around and taking orders. Why would you do that? But I was no fool. I was like, yeah, I'll write it. And so I took myself to like Luke boot camp and watched the movies and really studied Mark Hamill and what Lucas wanted from the character, et cetera. And it was great because I wound up with this appreciation of Luke that I hadn't quite had, despite having been, a Star Wars fan my whole life. And that was wonderful. But I had started out as a Han guy. So I was telling this story probably in a somewhat more coherent fashion at a con. And I was sitting next to Greg Rucka, um, who wrote the Han book. And Greg has this wonderful gravelly voice, and he keeps looking at me. We're literally sharing a microphone. He keeps looking at this story, and he goes. Finally, he takes the mic, and he goes, "That's really funny to hear, because I'd always been a Luke guy, and when they approached me about writing the Han book, I didn't quite know what to say." And Mike Siglain, the Lucasfilm creative director, is moderating the panel, and he's looking over us. And finally, he leans over to the mic, and he goes, "Why didn't one of you two idiots say something?" But at the same time, I think we're both glad we didn't, because that's a great example. Like, we wound up kind of pushing ourselves and emerged from that with this, love of character that, had always been there at Star Wars, but hadn't been nearly as intense as it had been before. So, as long as I can hear the Star Wars music in my head and close my eyes and see space battles and humming lightsabers and wonderful vistas. Like I'm all in. I'll make it work. There are great stories there, and it's just a privilege to get to play with them.
And I think that, too, it is nice when you have those moments where you really have to focus in on a character and you have to say, this character might not be the one that most naturally comes to me, but that you know that you have, it's a gift and a duty to get into their mind and to make it work. And
Yeah,
in the process, you do develop that appreciation for them. I mean, for me, it's taken, a similar form when I'll do theater and get a
yeah,
part that I didn't want, or get a part that I just,
yeah,
oh, like, why'd they cast me as this person? And then there is something though that when it's an assignment to focus on that character, even if it's not a character that you naturally gravitate towards, there really is something that like you latch onto them like, okay, you're mine now. And there
yeah,
is something really fun about that. And
yeah,
that's why it doesn't surprise me when authors, creators, when they get asked like who's your favorite, it never surprises me when people are like, they're all my favorite. Like it's like choosing a kid because you get attached to them in
yeah,
different ways, even if left to your own natural tendencies, you'd focus on something else.
yeah, yeah. No, the theater example is perfect. That's right. You may not get the part you want, but if you do your job, you're going to emerge from that with a greater understanding, appreciation, which is whether it's theater or books, is also so much fun.
Mhm. Yeah. And like I said earlier, collaborative. Like
Yeah,
there's something in this that it's about community, and it's fun that like the franchise that we all love and celebrate and criticize in equal measure.
yeah,
Because that's the way it's supposed to be. It's fun that it results in community, but that, it's something that it's an individualized love, but it's a process and a love and it's something that just has to be inherently communal. And
yeah,
if it wasn't, I certainly don't think that I would have, had the same kind of fervor for um this franchise the way that I have over even the last 4 years, let alone 40.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's a wonderful community, and there's also, I mean, there's a part of it as a writer that's additionally rewarding because I mean, writing by its nature is lonely. It's just you in front of a screen and a keyboard, and you got to kind of, you know, wring something out of the realm of maybe into making it actually exist, and that's hard, and it demands long hours by yourself, and so it is even more of a joy to get to go to a con or a signing, etc., and talk to fellow Star Wars fans about something that we both love. I mean, it's
Mhm.
I've never had an experience where I haven't come back like energized and wanting to tell more stories, or if there's not something immediately on my plate, wanting to go back and enjoy old ones. And yeah, no, I'm very grateful for this community.
I think that we can all agree with that. As we're wrapping up, just a couple of questions that I'm curious about. Is there anything that you're working on, now that you can talk about, or anything else that you want to promote that already has come out?
I mean, check out Timelines. It was
Mhm.
super fun, and I mean, we've been talking about collaboration. Just an astonishing example of that. I mean, not just the team of authors working together, but I mean, these wonderful, wonderful people at DK. I mean, Ruth Amos and Matt Jones, and a huge team over there that kept this kind of impossible project on track. And you know, I mean, books are so profoundly unfair. Like, I think I'm hoping we're going to do some timeline stuff in the near future, and it'll be some authors sitting on a Zoom, or maybe hopefully at a table, etc. But there's such a huge team of people who work so hard behind authors, and I'm incredibly grateful to all those people for everything they do. And yeah, now there should be more names on covers and not just in the back, because I mean it's absolutely essential. But that book was a blast and just huge, huge amount of fun. And like all Star Wars reference books, showed up immediately out of date, which is one of the frustrations of it. Like, the new stuff you can't get in. But while I was working on my segment of that, I had that experience, which I hope other people have. Was like, oh yeah, I gotta go watch that Clone Wars episode again, or I gotta go, check out that comic I'd forgotten about, and just dive back in and enjoy things. In terms of current projects, I'm working on some geography stuff, which I can't really talk about,
Woohoo!
but yeah, is super exciting, and I hope will bear fruit in the not so distant future. And then, who knows? Hopefully, a con near you, if you happen to be where the con is, and some other things.
Like
Um,
that was just very ambiguous.
that was a little ambiguous. It'll make sense soon, but
Yeah.
yeah, people will get it. But no, it's just as I said at the very beginning. I mean, I just feel incredibly lucky to get to do this, and incredibly lucky that I remain, get to be a creator, but remain a reader and a fan and a viewer, and all these great things. And that's as much a privilege as all the rest of it.
Well, I think that that is a mentality that is the best way to approach, I mean, being able to contribute to a franchise like this. I mean, there's nothing better than being able to do that and have it only increase your love of the world that you're working in. So, Jason, thank you so much for having this conversation tonight. Thank you so much for all of the work and the joy that you've given us over the years with your works, and certainly look forward to seeing what else that you have on the horizon. But to our listeners, thank you so much for for supporting us. And you can reach out, let us know what you think at Twitter at Rule the Galaxy. You can find me at Dark Saber Light, and we'll be back next week with another episode. May the Force be with you.